I've been a bad moderator. I've let this go longer, but these panels were so spectacular that the thought of limiting them at all would have been wrong, and I hope you'll agree with that. I think that our next speaker and final reactor has the unenviable task of trying to synthesize everything that's been heard as prelude to our discussion, our Q&A session. I know that he joins with me in the belief that this not only makes this particular issue better, but it makes healthcare and society better. And so it's now my delight to introduce Dr. Richard Frank, the Margaret T. Morris Professor of Health Economics in the Department of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School, who will be offering some concluding thoughts before our discussion.
Thanks. I think unenviable is sort of the right word. It's one of those situations where everything's been said, but not everybody said it, and I feel like I'm that extra person that's been injected. I'm going to start by making a couple of observations that are sort of cross-cutting that I think tries to organize all the working groups' work. And then I want to make a few comments about each of the groups. I think the task here is hard, and it's hard because essentially you're asking people and organizations to do stuff that they don't do naturally right now, right? Or don't do enough. And so each one of the groups is actually putting out taking on a variety of activities that are really aimed at sort of at the lowest intensity side, nudging people, and at the highest intensity side, pushing people into doing things differently. And each group is sort of accomplishing that by sort of establishing a set of facts about where we are. Second, they are generally trying to identify through the literature and through research, in a sense, how we got here. Then third, each of them seems to have, at least implicitly, a struggle with a theory of change. That is, how do we offer guidance based on a set of decisions that we want people to make differently? And that means identifying leverage points for implementation impact, maybe decision supports. And then finally, there's what are we going to have as evidence to know that things are being done differently? How are we going to know that we're making a difference, both in terms of the things we're trying to influence, but also in the bottom line metrics? And that was sort of the last group. So let me turn to each of the making a few comments about each of the work groups. On the training and education side, I am not going to spend much time talking about the prescribing side. One is because I think that is the deepest part of our literature. It's also the one area we've made the most progress on. I'm going to turn instead to focus more on training and education around treating people with substance use disorders. And I'm going to sort of remind you of what Mr. Emanuel once said when he was Obama's chief of staff, which is never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think here there's really an opportunity to sort of have a more enduring effect on the largest substance use disorder segment. And what I want to emphasize is that a lot of the problems that we have is that in general our professional educations are consistently inadequate in training people on issues around addiction. And whether it's alcohol or whether it's opioids or whether it's methamphetamine, we just sort of fall short of the mark typically. And so I would urge there to be thought about sort of some more general principles that underlie our educational system so that this becomes the mainstream, because in fact, as you know, there aren't that many people that overdose on just opioids, right? Usually there are multiple drugs in the system, and so that level of complexity, I think, is necessary to take on. I think the other part of education on the treatment of substance use disorder side that's tricky and that is sort of not easily fit into the normal way we do education is how complicated dealing with people who have various types of substance use disorders and addictions because their circumstances are so complicated. And if people, clinicians and clinical support staff aren't really well educated in how that whole picture comes together, they're not going to do the technical stuff right. And I think that that part of the education system is typically lacking. I mean, people they avoid substance use disorder treatment. They misunderstand the evidence about what works and what doesn't work, and in fact misrepresent the evidence about what works and what doesn't work. They rely on stereotypes, and this is, to some extent, part of the sort of professional side of the stigma that Gary was talking about earlier. The third remark on the education is I think they are doing a very good job by linking their work to the regulatory and licensing frameworks that are out there. And I would urge them to take one step, I think a little further than I heard, which was you need to pay attention to the licensing and certification of the organizations that these people work within. And Gary made that appeal, I think, at the end of his talk. And most states haven't revisited their addiction program licensing arrangements since about 1972. And the ones that have made the most incremental changes, and we know a lot more today, and we can do better. Finally, on metrics, and this cuts across all of them, I think we can do much better than we're doing by adopting common sense metrics. I know there's an industry out there. I know there's a lot of methodology that goes to it. I'm guilty of it as well. And methodology can very often come down to common sense made difficult. And I think we really have to pay attention to common sense, because if we don't do that, we're going to wait a long time, and we can save a lot of lives and do a lot better just by putting some common sense metrics in place, hold people's feet to the fire, and then let the methodology catch up. All right, let me turn to the guidelines. They start off sort of asking, what do we know? What do we think we know and don't know? What don't we know? And then there's the question, and this is what separates guidelines from a lot of other kind of evidence-based activities, is what are the best bets? Because if you're going to do guidelines, you're not going to have the full set, and you can't be silent. And I think silence would be a disservice. And so I think you need to have processes in place where you kind of offer up the best bets. And I think the idea of bringing together professionals and things like that is a good idea. Now, what are the levers for change? I think decision supports here are very important. Performance rewards, whether they be in the form of payment, and I think that Julie's caution is very well grounded. Aligning regulations, licensing, and all that to the way we do guidelines is important, and again, common sense metrics. Bill Clinton once said that almost every problem has had some really good ideas about how to solve it, and really the big problem is scaling, and I think that has a lot of truth to it. And I think the idea of sort of pulling together the elements of what works is very well conceived, and I think the way that the group has proposed advancing that is very sensible. I think we need to start where we are, and I didn't see enough attention being paid to where we are. I mean, let's remember, on a good day, 24% of people get treated, and usually it's somewhere between 10 and 24% get treated. A third of those who get treated get something that's likely to get them better, and about 40% of those that get something that might get them better stick with it. Now, if you guys can do the math, we're looking at sort of south of 3%. Okay, we need to know where we are, why we're there, and how injecting all this good work that they're proposing to do is going to allow us to change that trajectory. We're very thin on our use of evidence-based practices. I think the innovation focus that they propose on the high-risk populations is just right. I think that the risk groups that they're proposing to focus on, I think, are just right, and they emphasize the importance of understanding the circumstances. The criminal justice involved population, the underrepresented minorities, people living in extreme poverty. Those are people who have extraordinarily complex worlds that they live in. And so here, the treatment and prevention group really needs to spend a lot of time talking to the education group, because those things dovetail. Let me just make one more comment about this group, which is that I think the organization of the clinical programs is very important, and figuring out what organizations are going to sustain the kinds of things that work is important, and then how do you pay for those organizations so that they are sustained to do the good work. And again, common sense metrics. Let me finish off just by making a couple of comments about the metrics research and data group. I think that they're just right to focus on the gaps in evidence. I would add at least two other items to their to-do list. The first is, I think not only do they need to identify the gaps, but they need to prioritize where the payoffs are in terms of filling those gaps. All ignorance is not created equal. And I think that there are hard judgment calls to make, and you have to make some projections about what you think the potential to get things better are, and then what impact that will have. And I think that is a very important thing, and I think that then leads to my second item on the to-do list, which is, I think that making recommendations for how the field needs to invest is important. I think that is probably, and that doesn't need to wait till the end and having metrics. I think setting the priorities for getting evidence and deciding which evidence is so important that you must have it soon, and proposing how to make investments there, I think will be critical. There's a great effort. I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to learn about it, and hopefully I was reasonably quick.